Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion on what's happening in South Africa's energy capital. Today, we'll hear from investigative journalism and just energy transition experts about their experiences of reporting on the renewable energy revolution, how communities on the ground are being affected, the challenges faced with managing jet finances, and how the money is being spent. My name is Roxanne Joseph, and I'll be facilitating today. I work with Oxpeckers as a project manager and have been helping to build the Power Tracker program since early 2022. Before we begin, we have a bit of housekeeping. Please can you use the Q&A box for any questions that you have? You can do this throughout the webinar. You can use the chat box for general comments or communications. Please also go ahead and use the chat box to introduce yourself to us and everyone joining today. If you'd like to say something, please raise your hand by using the raise hand icon at the bottom of the screen. When asked to do so, you can turn on your camera and unmute yourself before speaking. We'll also remind you about this at the end of the event, but before you leave here today, we ask that you please complete a very short survey of just 2 or 3 questions so we know who you are and to get a bit of feedback on the session. Just quickly, our agenda today will include a few words from the New Economy Hub, who've been supporting Power Tracker for the past 18 months. This will be followed by our panel discussion, where we'll be looking at what's actually happening in SA's energy capital, from the human cost of energy to the finances behind it all. And then we'll have time for a couple of questions, and we'll end with a few closing remarks. For those of you who are new here, the Power Tracker project maps, tracks, and investigates renewable and coal-based energy sources. The project was launched by Oxpeckers Investigative Environmental Journalism in 2022 amidst a rise in climate crisis reporting. Our motivation behind the project is the need for journalists and other stakeholders to move beyond merely raising awareness and anxiety about the threats of climate change to focusing on what measures are being put in place on the ground to counter the causes. In many parts of the world, including Africa, countries are switching to less polluting renewable power sources, such as solar, wind, geothermal, biomass, and hydropower. Now, billions are being pledged to build these resources, which inevitably led us to ask, where do these investments end up? How are they being used? And are they actually making a difference? As part of the Oxpeckers Training and Professional Support Program, we've worked with journalists throughout sub-Saharan Africa over the past 2 years to interrogate these issues. Today, we'll provide insights from the second iteration of the project, which has zoomed in on the Mpumalanga province that we affectionately refer to as South Africa's energy capital. The Mpumalanga Power Tracker is a collaboration with the African Climate Foundation's New Economy Hub, which partners with those campaigning to decarbonize South Africa and build an inclusive net zero economy that delivers social security and economic justice. Joining us today is the Hub's director, Sekhohlane Phamodi, who will say a few words to kick things off. Thanks for joining us, Sekhohlane. Without your support, Mpumalanga Power Tracker would not have been made possible. I'll hand over to you for a few minutes, if you can just turn on your camera.
Thanks so much, Roxanne. Good morning, everyone. It's really great to be here and to get the further insights that Oxpecker Center for Investigative Environmental Journalism has been doing with the Power Tracker project around how the energy transition is unfolding in Mpumalanga province and the rest of the country effectively, because this is not just a provincial transition, it's a transition that is happening mainly in one province to transform our energy future as a country. Now, as Roxanne has indicated, the New Economy Hub works with people to build, support, and amplify the social engagement and support for the concrete development pathways that will deliver us an equitable energy system that's anchored in renewables and which can be leveraged to build a new decarbonized economy that does the work of transforming our economy to mitigate inequality, unemployment, and multidimensional poverty, which in our context we know are not only extreme, but are also fundamentally racialized because of our history. Now, to deliver us this new economy, from our perspective, South Africa must invest in the technology, the communities, and the people who will be able to build us this productive, inclusive, and net zero economy. And fundamentally, it must the investments must also deliver the energy security, secure livelihoods, and the livable planet that we need in the context of this the unfolding climate emergency that we're in, and the catastrophic consequences it poses, not only for our economy, but also the livability of our society in South Africa, never mind the rest of the world. And so the core focus here for us is, how do we support those folks who, like Oxpeckers, who are doing the work of really bringing people along in the story, ensuring that there is clarity of information and understandings around what work is happening where, what investments are coming in, whom they're benefiting, and what more is required. And so we're really very proud to support the Power Tracker project for as long as we have, since 2023. And we really hope that, and have been seeing that it has really been a useful and productive tool for more than just ourselves and perhaps Oxpeckers, but for all those who have a direct and vested interest in how things unfold and improve in the transitioning of the energy system, not only for the energy system's sake, but also for the people of Mpumalanga, who have long been at the fence line of the coal and power economy, which now must be transformed into an economy that's anchored in renewables that benefits them as much as it does the rest of the country and the economy. So without further ado, I'd really like to just hand over to Roxanne, and I really am very excited to hear the new insights, the emerging debates, and data that we can learn from as we all contribute to ensuring that this energy transition really unfolds in a fair and equitable way, albeit in a rapid manner, given the context of our climate emergency and the impact it is imminently having on our economy as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sekoklani. It's always great to hear from some of our biggest supporters. And as I said, without you, Mpumalanga Power Tracker would not have happened. So thanks for that. We'll now move on to the main event of today's webinar, a panel discussion with 4 experts who know all about reporting on the complexities of South Africa's just energy transition. First up, we have Andiswa Matiklina, an associate at Oxpeckers and data manager of the Power Tracker tool. Then we'll hear from Thabo Molelekwa, also an associate at Oxpeckers and an investigative journalist who's produced multiple stories as part of the Power Tracker program. Both Andiswa and Thabo have spent time in Mpumalanga and will offer us an important perspective of what's happening on the ground. We'll also hear from climate justice academic Katrina Lehman-Gruber, who works at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, or SCIS, at Wits University. Finally, we'll hear from Neil Cole, Financing Manager for the President's Just Energy Transition Implementation Plan Project Management Unit, or the PMU. Katrina and Neil will offer us different perspectives on where and how JET money has been spent and address some of the challenges that come with managing and tracking this. So just for a bit of context, following the money is a significant part of the work we do at Power Tracker. And after nearly 2 years of trying to get more clarity on where and how JET finances are being spent, we are still no closer to having all the answers, which is why we've invited these experts to shed light on the finances behind the just energy transition. We'll start things off with Andiswa, who will be sharing our findings and investigations over the last 18 months. Over to you, Andiswa.
Thank you so much, Roxanne, and good morning to everyone that's joining us today. So I'll be speaking about our findings and investigations as Power Tracker over the past 18 months. First of all, I'd say that from our investigations and data collection, we have uncovered that renewable energy is definitely on the rise in Mpumalanga. We've seen a steady increase in the number of projects that are being implemented in the province since in these projects between 2021 and 2023. From the projects that we've mapped, about 26,600 megawatts of energy would actually be added to the grid if all of these projects came online, as some of the projects are in different stages of production or some or implementation rather. A majority of the projects, which is about 84%, are private projects, and most of these projects are actually solar projects with a total number of 118 on the power tracker map. We've also noted that most of the projects are concentrated close to Eskom's coal-fired power stations in the regions or the towns of Mpumalanga, Ermelo, as well as Middelburg. Currently, the data that we have on the map shows that a projected total of about 140 billion rands is needed to decommission and repurpose all 12 coal-fired power stations that are owned by Eskom. However, from engagements with Eskom and announcements that have been made recently, you will know, or some of our attendees might know, that decommissioning plans have currently been paused until the year 2030. We also noted that although it's slow, progress is actually being made at Komati Power Station, which is the first decommissioning, repurposing, and repowering project as South Africa embarks on a just energy transition. Our engagements with Eskom also revealed that they have established a community information center at the Komati Power Station, which allows for easy access to information on the Komati Just Energy Transition Initiative, and to also share employment and training opportunities with members of the community as well as the general public outside of Komati. However, engagements that we have done with stakeholders on the ground in the province still show that people have very little knowledge about what is going on at Komati, and perhaps that is where the focus should be, and making sure that people are updated about what is actually happening inside the power station and what opportunities they can get from that whole repurposing plan. Next slide, please. So our focus this year as Power Tracker has also been on new technologies as well as energy pathways that are being introduced in the province as part of this just energy transition. One of our investigations looked into a pilot project for liquefied natural gas, or LNG, which is in Amersfoort and is owned by Kinetico Energy. We also investigated or interrogated the controversies surrounding LNG, as questions were raised about whether is it really a green source of energy. We also looked into carbon capture and storage pilot project, which is based in Leandra in Mpumalanga, close to emission sources from Sasol, as well as several coal mines and coal-fired power plants. From our investigation, we noted that this was actually a desktop feasibility assessment, and a lot of questions from online engagement with different stakeholders were raised about equating air pollution with carbon emissions. This project, although we had reported about it earlier on in the year, was officially launched this past Friday by the Mpumalanga provincial government. We also looked into the ambitious green hydrogen development plans by French development company HDF, which is planning to create a mega green hydrogen plant or project in Mpumalanga called Renewables. And with this project, they predict that it can mitigate up to half of the Eskom load shedding. HDF is one of the 4 companies that entered into land lease agreements with Eskom for land use on different power stations where they would develop renewable energy projects. So as Power Tracker, we requested power purchase agreements relating to these from Eskom earlier on in the year, but they revealed that the companies would be entering into their own agreements with their own private off-takers for the energy produced at these plants, and that the land lease contracts that they had with these companies could not be made public because of confidentiality issues. So as the energy transition continues, we also reported on the untapped potential of critical minerals in the province. As we know, renewable energy technologies will depend on the integration of battery and energy storage solutions. We therefore found that there is significant potential for future development and investment in transition minerals in the province. Mpumalanga has a wealth of critical minerals needed for green energy storage rather. As you'll see on the screen, mapped in different parts of Mpumalanga, we have nickel, copper, cobalt, vanadium, and manganese. However, we found in the investigation by one of our journalists and associates that most of these resources are currently being exported. One of the sources that we interviewed for that investigation also noted that while there's a significant demand for energy storage solutions, the local supply chain in South Africa and Mpumalanga specifically is very underdeveloped. We noted that local manufacturing could actually reduce dependency on inputs, create jobs, and stimulate the economy in the province. But setting up such manufacturing plants for renewable energy storage production requires significant capital investment. This is an area that we will be investigating more in future as Power Tracker and Power Tracker journalists and associates. Thanks a lot, Roxanne.
Thanks for that, Andiswa. It's so important to show what goes on behind the scenes and for our participants to understand what goes into running a program like Power Tracker. So thanks for sharing some of your findings and experiences. Next, we'll hear from Thabo, who will discuss the human cost of the energy transition, including experiences from affected communities, the unions, and the business sector. The floor is all yours, Thabo.
Good morning, everyone. So yeah, on top of what my colleague has discussed, I'm going to focus more on how all these issues have affected the communities on the ground. We visited the Mpumalanga province. We went to townships like Emelo, Witbank, Middelburg. We visited Komati. I can say we visited all the coal fields communities. And when we went there, I remember our first stop was actually Emelo. And yeah, this was the interesting one. It's a trip that I actually took a few days just before Christmas. It was December. And when we got there, people, there's a lot of things that we found out. We found that a lot of people in that community, they work for Camden. Camden is one of the Eskom coal-fired power stations, and there's also Transnet, meaning 80% of the population in the Emelo townships, they are employed by Camden and Transnet. And when we spoke to these people, some of them are the people that have lost their jobs from these companies. One of our stories, the stories that we did in December when we did our first stop in Emelo, have someone who actually worked at Camden. These people, they tell us that they have only one problem when it comes to the energy transition, is the lack of consultations, which I believe that the PMU will actually maybe talk about during their presentation. Unfortunately, PCC is not here, but what I know is that most of the consultations are done by the PCC, and I know I've seen some that they've done, but specifically for Emelo, these people, they said they haven't seen consultations, and that puts them in a very tight situation to say, do we accept this energy transition or not? Because on top of our heads, we actually don't know what the transition is. All we know is that we are going to lose our jobs. Their minds will be closed. This is what people have been telling us. And we also spoke to people who are in the informal business. When you go to these communities, you will see a lot of informal businesses in the coal sector. And by looking at these businesses, you will see that they employ a large number of people in the communities. People can feed their families from these informal businesses. These informal businesses are somehow connected in the chain of the coal sector. And all of those people also in the dark, they also complain about not knowing what is going to happen with the transition, because nobody has come to them and talked to them about the energy transition. And we also went to Benicon Park, which is next to Duva, and there's a lot that we saw. The most part of that community is informal settlement, and people, they've been telling us that the mines that are operating in Duva itself, they are actually not meeting what they've actually promised to the communities. And also, even though there's a lot of people that are employed in these coal mines and also Duva, but they also have a problem to say, we can't just accept the transition because we know that a lot of people are going to lose their jobs. And when people lose their jobs, they will struggle to feed their families. While talking to the communities, I remember I mentioned that in a previous slide that there is people who are in the informal business. There's people who are employees of these companies who are coming from these communities, and these people, they have unions. So after hearing their sides of the stories, we were like, no, let's hear from their unions that what is actually happening with the energy transition, specifically in the Mpumalanga. So we went to the NUM office. We spoke to my guy right there. You can see him on the picture there. We spoke to him. The NUM highlighted that they don't, as a union, they don't have a problem with the energy transition, but their problem is how this whole thing is actually facilitated, because their members are in the dark, they don't know anything. And they are also concerned about their reskilling. NUM says they know that the government is talking about reskilling and reskilling, but now you talk about reskilling, but it is actually not happening at the TVET colleges. NUM told us that the current skills that are produced now as we talk at the TVET colleges, the colleges that actually supports the coal industry in Mpumalanga with a lot of skills, are still producing the old skills that we know that are used in the coal sector. There is nothing about a new reskilling program in terms of the just energy transition. So they were very much concerned about the current education system in the TVET colleges, to say we can't talk about energy transition that must happen very fast, but reskilling is taking time to happen. And also, we visited Komati. Now, when we talk about Komati, you know, there's a what people must understand. Now, Komati on its own, that was according to my understanding. Other speakers will come after me, will correct me, but what I know is that that was a first pilot phase, and that was an ESCOM, specifically ESCOM program. That's why you can see that reskilling is actually happening now. They have partnered with the Cape Peninsula University of Technology. They've got funds to do that. But however, when I was in Komati, I did meet people who said, we have lost our jobs because of this transition at Komati. I then asked, how come? Because a lot of people from ESCOM have been taken to other power stations. They said, no, those were specifically ESCOM employees, but the contractors, remember, these power stations, they don't operate with only their employees, but they've got contractors. They contracted some other people to come bring their services. All those people who were contractors, they lost their jobs. And I think that's when people must understand, when we say people have lost their jobs, and ESCOM will come and say, no, people have not lost their jobs. So we talk about people that were contractors working within ESCOM. So those are the people that have been affected by the energy transition. And we personally, the people of this place that we visited, they said they personally believe that this reskilling programs and the energy transition must not focus only on ESCOM employees, saying the employees, they will be transferred to other power stations, reskilling programs will happen to them, but they must also focus at the larger community that they operate in, to say what is going to happen with the people of these communities that we operate in. The other people we have met local businesses who are actually operating in these places. We have met bigger companies in the coal sector, like you see there, that is Mike Deke, who's the CEO at Seriti. We have met with them, sat with them down to talk about the implications of the energy transition. So they also have a problem that there's actually a lack of communication between businesses, the government, and whoever is actually involved or responsible to actually facilitate the energy transition. So they feel that they are not involved in the conversation. However, these private companies now have actually tried to actually do something for themselves. Like the company that I just mentioned, we know they are doing something now in Mpumalanga. They are not the only company. A few companies now we see development of wind farms is actually emerging now in Mpumalanga. So they are trying to actually cater for the communities and their employees that when the time comes to say, not necessarily close down the coal-fired power stations, but maybe halve the number or limit the number of the people who will be operating there. They know that maybe a large number of people will not lose their jobs because they will also be able to be employed on the other side of the operations, which is the green sector. So yeah, some of the businesses, they have tried to do that for themselves, and we will see my colleague Andiswa spoke about the GH2 developments in Mpumalanga, and also that those are the private companies who came into Mpumalanga and they are doing that in the province. And while doing that, obviously they are employing people from the province. So this is what has been happening on the side of the private sector. And they also mentioned that the business people have mentioned that they actually need support for these SEZs, and obviously the renewable energy development zones. It's quite not clear for now what's the status of that. So we are also hoping on our side that we can be able to get that in, and also those who are in the business sector. This is what they've been saying to us in terms of the transition.
Thanks, Thabo. It's excellent to see that your work with these communities really feels like a collaboration, and it's even better to see what impacts your investigations have already achieved. Just to say, everyone, you can go onto oxpeckers.org to see all of the investigations that and our other Power Tracker reporters have published over the last 8 months. Thabo. Now hear from Katrina Lehman-Gruber. Katrina is a researcher on climate change and inequality at the Center for Inequality Studies at Wits University. Katrina will speak to how jet money is being spent and what we can expect ahead of this year's COP29. Over to you, Katrina.
Thanks so much. And thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's really exciting to kind of be together with journalists and hearing about some of the fascinating work that they've been doing. So yeah, I've been asked to zoom out a little bit and give kind of an overview of the just energy transition financing, which is largely happening at a national level, but as we'll see, has some impacts and projects in the Mpumalanga region. So a lot of the momentum around the just energy transition followed on from the Just Energy Transition Partnership deal, which was announced at COP26 in 2021. And basically, this was a deal that South Africa signed with several countries in the global north. So we've got the USA, the UK, the European Union, France, and Germany, basically to help South Africa achieve a just energy transition. So it was originally for $8.5 billion. It's since increased because several other countries have come on board, and it's now at approximately $11.6 billion, which is around 200 billion rand. But although this sounds like quite a lot of money, achieving a just energy transition in South Africa is estimated to cost around $85 billion. So that's 1.5 trillion rand just over the next 5 years. So as we can see, the JETP deal is actually only quite a small portion of that. But there is also other climate finance, which I won't really be talking about today, including quite a lot of domestic finance. So there's this report, the South African Climate Finance Landscape Report, where you can kind of find out a little bit more about other kinds of climate finance. Another part about kind of this JP deal is the type of financing. So I think when we think of climate finance, we often think of kind of money that the global north pays countries in the global south broadly, because they have kind of benefited from historical emissions and are the main cause of emissions and climate change, whereas countries in the global south are kind of the most vulnerable to impacts. And yet we're seeing the kind of vast majority of this money coming in the form of loans. So even though a lot of it is concessional loans, so around half, only 6.5% is coming in the form of grants, which is something that's been kind of critiqued, not only from civil society, but also kind of government actors. Despite making up the kind of biggest portion of the money, we actually know pretty little about the loan component, except for some of the kind of broad categories. So there's one example, 600 million euros for sovereign policy-based loans to national treasury. These aren't earmarked loans, so they're just kind of loans to the government and are supposed to support policy and institutional reforms undertaken by government in support of the just energy transition. So one of the reasons it seems that so little of the kind of loan portion of the funding has already flowed is that Eskom is no longer allowed to take on any debt. So when the Eskom debt relief bill was announced by National Treasury, basically Eskom, as a condition of that relief from National Treasury, has said that Eskom can't take on any additional loans. This has been a major block because Eskom was supposed to be one of the intended beneficiaries, given that it's the main actor in our energy system, particularly in terms of decommissioning and kind of expansion and upgrades to the grid. So this has been kind of one of the major issues. And then one of the other kind of concerns has been about the transparency around these loans. As I've said, we don't know a lot about them, and particularly about kind of the terms and conditions associated with these loans. And historically, there have been really kind of disastrous social consequences associated with forms of international funding, like from the IMF, with structural adjustment programs that had kind of really devastating social consequences and economic consequences. Kind of contrary to the loan portion, we actually know quite a lot about the grants. So at COP last year, the grant register was announced and a new update was released in July. And basically this register is kind of a long list of the projects with a little bit of detail about them. So we know that there are 151 grant projects, about 10.8 billion rand. And we can kind of see some of the portfolios, when the money was spent, who gets it, etc. So almost all of this money is already out the door, and these projects are kind of already underway or long gone. And actually most of this happened, or about half of that money was spent before the consultations on the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan. So there was some critique of kind of when this, when the register was first announced, of kind of how were these projects decided on, who decided on them, kind of how could this money have already been spent before we even had consultations on the Just Energy Transition Plan. In terms of the portfolios, we can see kind of the different portfolios of the Just Energy Transition, and actually we can see that the Mpumalanga Just Transition gets kind of a large proportion, 24%, together with green hydrogen. In terms of kind of the implementing agencies and kind of the beneficiaries of this, we see kind of municipalities, government departments, research institutes, some consulting firms, Presidential Climate Commission, and then a small number of NGOs getting the money. So of the kind of full amount, Mpumalanga gets 2.6 billion rand. And I just wanted to share a couple of examples of these kinds of projects that are happening. So there's a coal ash beneficiation project, which is about kind of turning mine waste for construction, a pilot project. The piloting of social ownership models for renewable energy. There's funding for the Presidential Climate Commission for stakeholder engagement, funding for the Medical Research Council to conduct research on the health impacts of coal, money to big consulting firms like BCG and PwC for private investment and project development in the area. There's funding to a Canadian union to support local unions, study on energy poverty by the Centre for Sustainability Transitions and the Presidential Climate Commission, and then some funding for TVET support. So the next question is, but kind of how does this money flow? And I was quite surprised to learn that, in fact, kind of donor countries decide individually what projects they want to fund according to their own criteria and procurement rules. So I think kind of many of us had thought or would assume that kind of the kind of grant funding comes into a big pot and then that is distributed or kind of allocated by a certain set of criteria. But actually what happens is that kind of, say, USAID will put out a call for applications for a specific project, and then kind of organizations can apply for that specific call. A lot of the money also flows through intermediary bodies or kind of is used for technical assistance, which actually means that some of that money will flow back into donor country organizations, their employees or other foreign experts, and doesn't necessarily all trickle down to South African organizations, let alone actually to affected communities and workers. But there are these plans for a JET funding platform, which is supposed to be announced this year, which is a platform to kind of match the donors and the recipients, which I think could aid in some of the transparency around who, how, and why certain projects have been selected, but also kind of as a centralized point for the just energy transition funding. The last quick thing I want to talk about is COP29. So the COPs are the kind of annual UN climate change conferences. It'll be happening this year in November in Azerbaijan. And this COP is known now as the Climate Finance COP. So it's really at the top of the agenda. And this is mainly because a new global finance goal is to be announced. And this basically sets out how much money countries of the global north should be providing and funding to countries of the global south to address climate change every year. There was a previous goal from 2009, so this is supposed to be an update, which was supposed to achieve $100 billion per year before 2020. That goal was actually missed. But this basically is supposed to act as the floor for what should come next, and estimates of what's actually required by countries of the global south is kind of orders of magnitude higher than this. Negotiations for this new goal have been underway for several years already, and it's not going well, it seems. There are questions about who should pay, so whether countries like China, kind of the new emitters, should pay, countries in the Gulf, how much, of course, but also in what form. So this question of kind of loans versus grants, etc. And from South Africa at this COP, we're not really sure what to expect. COPs have traditionally been where kind of the big JET announcements are made. So the JP, the investment plan, the implementation plan. So potentially we'll kind of hear something new in the kind of JET policy processes. Yeah, thanks so much. It's my email address if you'd like to contact me, but I hope that's been useful and interesting to contextualize some of what's happening in Mpumalanga.
Thanks, Katrina. Your presentation is a really nice way of expanding on a very complex topic that I think we should know or all know more about. Finally, we will hear from Neil Cole, the financing manager at the presidency's PMU, that's the project management unit, who are handling the JET implementation plan. The PMU is responsible for the mobilization, disbursement, and effective implementation of the JET IP spending plan. So Neil will share a bit about the inner workings of the unit. Over to you, Neil.
Thank you very much, Roxanne, and thank you also to the previous panelists, some really good insights. My presentation is going to, I think, dovetail quite nicely with that of Katrina. At times maybe sound a bit like a duet. Some overlap, but also I think important updates that I'm going to be able to provide. So I do want to start globally and then come to the SA climate finance landscape so that we can unpack some of the quantity, but also the quality of the financing. Because I think going into COP29, it cannot just be about the quantity of the same old type of financing, but also the quality of the financing is going to have to be improved so that countries can indeed access those finances. And then I'll go into the JET IP, some challenges that delay the investments and the flow of funds. Katrina mentioned some of this already in terms of the ESCOM debt relief, And then maybe as the update, what are some of the measures underway to unlock the funding flows? And the funding platform that Katrina mentioned is one of the mechanisms that we are putting in place and will be launching in October to unlock the funding flows and also provide greater transparency. And then just some concluding remarks. So in terms of the global climate finance landscape, what we can see is that mitigation clearly takes up the bulk of the climate financing that has already been mobilized, and also in terms of the need. So mitigation represents about 91% of climate finance. The current investment levels of 1.2 trillion, as has been said, and as you may know, is nowhere near enough to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, because we need an average investment of 9 trillion by 2030. So that doesn't leave us with a great deal of time in order to mobilize an extraordinary amount of financing. And I'm always reminded of the kind of mobilization of finance that countries undertook in order to defend their territories during World War II. I mean, the UK mobilized about 45% of their, or 48% of their GDP. And, this is starting to feel that maybe we need to be moving in that kind of direction where we recognize the existential crisis in order to get to those levels of financing that is required. Just in terms of the type of financing instruments, in adaptation, a lot of it has been project level market rate debt, and that has largely been borrowing by the public sector, whereas in mitigation, the project level market rate debt has largely been borrowing by the private sector. And as you can see, grants represent a small proportion of the total climate finance. So the sort of in mitigation, you can see it represents 4% of the total financing for mitigation. And just to say that this is the global landscape of climate finance that was published in 2023. And then there's also the balance sheet financing, and this would typically be the investments in mitigation undertaken by electricity utility companies, where off their balance sheet they are financing decommissioning programs. The South African climate finance landscape, very similar to the global trend, where mitigation receives the bulk of the climate finance investments. In terms of the diagram on the right-hand side, you can see an very significant increase in private investments, and that's once more largely in mitigation and largely in the REAP program, plotting from 2017-19 to the more recent South African climate finance landscape that was published in 2023 and also tabled at COP28, where we can see a very significant increase, but a decrease in public investments. And this could, as the disclaimer says, could be as a result of a decrease, as a result of the more accurate tagging rather than a decrease in actual flows. So just to summarize what's been happening in the South African climate finance landscape, as the diagram showed in the previous slide, a threefold increase in private investment. The majority of the flows have been facilitated through market rate debt instruments. And as I said, the REAP in both solar and wind investments represents the bulk of that. Grant financing decreased from an annual average of 3.5 billion. But what we expect with the next SA climate finance landscape is that the grant component will increase because of the JET IP, where there are these grant commitments that took effect from around about the end of 2021 going into 2022 as we were developing the JET investment plan. The concessional debt tracked in 2019-21 averaged 2.4 billion per year, and the same point that was made about grant financing that will increase with the JET IP commitments. The concessional debt will also increase in terms of the pledges, and much of that still needs to be unlocked with the Eskom debt relief conditions placing a moratorium on that. What we have been spending a considerable amount of time on has been in looking at ways in which that concessional debt can be unlocked. And then there are just some additional numbers for agriculture, forestry, and other land use, which also includes fisheries, and then the water sector, and also investment in low carbon transport. And as Katrina also encouraged, please have a look at both the global climate finance landscape as well as the SA finance landscape that was brought out jointly by the PCC and Green Cape. On the JET IP financing, this is the often spoken of close to 1.5 trillion rand financing need. It is a financing need between 2023 and 2027 for a prioritized list of sectors, the electricity sector taking up the bulk of that financing need, new energy vehicle sector, green hydrogen sector, and in those two, it is mainly the preparatory work, the initial capital investments that would need to be undertaken, the kind of incentive programs, if they are to be put in place, where the bulk of that financing need is going to be required. And just to say that, I mean, the 1.5 trillion is a financing need. It is the costing of the JET IP over the 5-year period. It is not an amount that sits in a budget anywhere. It is a financing need that was costed, with some of the financing in pledges and some of the financing already mobilized. But the financing gap is still quite significant. We're looking at all potential sources of financing and financing instruments. If one was to think of the proportionality between the public, blended, and private, we estimate that around 10% will come from public finance, and this would be both local and international. Blended financing could be a blending between concessional finance made available by international development finance institutions blended with local commercial debt and equity, and then the bulk would come from the 60% is estimated to come through private investment. And as indicated in the table, the financing requirement associated with the electricity sector represents the biggest proportion, and that's also where we have allocated and costed the just transition components and also the investments, specific investments for Mpumalanga, which includes the accelerated coal transition program. Just a point on the municipal capacity that is required for the transition, about 200 billion of that is required just on the maintenance backlog of the distribution grid. If one was to think about more systemically about the electricity system, the distribution grid that municipalities manage is very key to the transition. I thought I would include this table. It is the financing of the accelerated coal transition investment plan that is embedded in the JET investment plan. It is $2.6 billion that is included in the $8.5 billion pledge made by the international community. And it is the decommissioning, repurposing, and capacity replacement, including the socioeconomic impact in respect of Camden, Grootvlei, and Hendrina coal power plants. As we are moving towards the implementation of the Act investment plan, we certainly take the lessons of Kumati, and one of those lessons is to take a multi-phase approach, which is less of a linear approach. So what we want to front load, move on first, is the socioeconomic impact projects. So the community development projects that is first out of the blocks, provided that there is a clear path in these projects towards achieving the decommissioning and the carbon emission reductions targets that have been set. So as you can see, it essentially shows that this is a public-private partnership with the STIF being the Climate Investment Fund's contribution of 500 million, 450 million of that is the highly concessional financing, highly concessional in that it has an interest rate below 1%, a grace period of 8%, and depending on the negotiating terms, a tenure of anywhere between 20 and 30 years. That then, and then the 50 million is that makes up the 500 million is a grant. That 500 million leverages an additional just over or just under 900 million from the 3 MDBs. The IRBD is the component of the World Bank that finances projects in middle income countries like South Africa. The IFC is the International Finance Corporation, so that is the private lending window of the World Bank, and then the African Development Bank are the 3 MDBs that will be participating in the financing of the Act. Then you have country counterparts, so this could be a DBSA or an IDC that could come in and participate, and then there's an estimated 875 million that is an estimated investment by the private sector based on a SIF ratio that has been applied previously of 1:5. So 500 million US dollars as the SIF contribution is expected to leverage an additional investment by the MDBs and the private sector that then takes you to that 2.6 billion. And it is expected that the private sector investments will be largely in the repurposing and the repowering as is shown in this table. And I'll just try to move on a bit faster. So this is a table that many of you would be, I think, more familiar with, and this is the the IPG offer. It also includes the non-IPG members. So the original IPG total has gone up from 8.5 to 8.9, and that is largely because of an increase in the grants contribution. And then there are 2 new IPG members, Denmark and the Netherlands, and non-IPG international partners being Spain, Switzerland, and Canada. So we're now sitting on 11.6. The policy loans that Katrina referred to is not yet included in this table. I mean, except for a 600 million that was part of the very early pledge by France through the French Development Agency and Germany through the German Development Bank, totaling 600 million. That was part of the prior commitments for the development of the Just Transition Framework, as well as the JET investment plan. But the new policy loans haven't been included yet, because that is still subject to negotiations around policy outcomes and also results that are expected to be delivered on based on a set of outcome indicators. So these policy loans are not clearly linked to a project. They are very clearly linked to a set of policy outcomes. So just coming to the
Hi,
end
Neil.
of the presentation.
Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. We do need to start wrapping up,
Okay.
but please go ahead and finish.
Okay, so let me very quickly run through just some of the challenges on the public finance side. I mean, it's the known lack of fiscal space, the levels of public debt and contingent liabilities resulting in, I mean, constraints on taking on further loans, even if they are concessional loans, especially where the concessional loans require a sovereign guarantee, and sovereign guarantees contribute towards contingent liabilities. It's obviously, I mean, we need to recognize the competing priorities, not only South Africa, but many low income and other middle income countries. The point that I made right at the beginning around the quality and quantity of especially MDB and DFI funding, and then, you know, the absorptive capacity of SOCs. On the private finance side, I think there's still lingering uncertainties around policy changes, technological advancements, and then also some market dynamics. The constraints on the transition grid and the challenges with scaling up investments in the transmission grid has limited investments in the renewable energy independent power producer program, and then also some issues around the cost of capital. I've included a slide on blended financing with a definition, and I'm sure, you know, this is going to be shared with everyone or made available, and can be made available. Let me just make that point. But we believe that blended finance is going to be increasingly used as a mechanism to finance especially mitigation efforts, and increasingly we're going to have to turn to credit guarantee facilities where the need for sovereign guarantees can be decreased, or even at times become not necessary, right? And then I've included just some measures underway to unblock funding flows. Christina referred to the Eskom debt moratorium that placed a constraint, prevented Eskom at the time from undertaking any new borrowing. We are in negotiations with the National Treasury, and this has been reported on, for there to be consideration given to a waiver for especially the accelerated coal transition investment plan, seeing that does have included in the financing structure the 500 million highly concessional loan that then leverages private investment. And then there's the JET funding platform, which I want to make then my last slide. And the JET funding platform is a mechanism where we want to match grant funders with beneficiaries. We've listed the types of grant funders, not only the IPG, but also DFIs, MDBs, philanthropies, and corporates that provide grant financing or a type of grant financing. And the JET funding platform will then do that matchmaking with SMMEs, CBOs, NGOs, trade unions, and also government institutions. We have an advisory committee that is providing a lot of the strategic advice, but the actual matching is going to be done by the PMU with a independent technical consultancy that we're in the process of appointing, that will provide inputs into project preparation, due diligence, etc. Right? But this will be providing a lot more of the transparency that is also links the projects that will be matched to the grant register that Katrina referred to, that already provides quarterly reports. And then maybe just final thing to say is that we are working on a register for the concessional loans, all commercial debt and equity, as well as the policy loans. So let me end there. Some concluding comments, but you'll see this when the presentation is made available. Thank you, Roxanne, and sorry for maybe taking up more time than I should have.
Thanks so much, Neil. No worries. And thank you so much for your presentation. I think, as you said, it really did dovetail nicely on from Katrina's and further unpacked an incredibly complex issue.